In the DC Comics title Final Crisis, Batman confronts the villain Darkseid during the climax, brandishing a gun. He tells Darkseid that in order to save the universe, he's breaking his two most crucial rules, using a gun and taking a life. Upon shooting him, Batman is then killed by Darkseid's Omega Beams. That is, until he was brought back to life months later, because the comic book machine must continue turning. Batman is known for many things, but one of his most defining characteristics is his fervent anti-gun beliefs. But the Dark Knight's crusade against firearms hasn't always been core to his character. In fact, in the early days, Batman was a very pro-gun utilitarian hero, and often took the lives of many of the criminals he pursued. All for the greater good, of course. However, not too long after the character entered the public consciousness, he began to change, morphing into the idealistic hero of strict moral codes we know today. So today we're going to take a look at Batman's short history as a weapon-carrying killer and his evolution into a hero who would forsake firearms and killing. It's a well-known fact that Bruce Wayne's parents were killed by gun violence when he was a boy. Hell, at this point it's practically a modern myth. Since then, Bruce Wayne has devoted his life to fighting crime as Batman. In the modern era of comics, Batman is seen as a champion against gun violence, which makes a lot of sense when you consider that his parents were killed as a direct result of it. But that aspect of his character wasn't always a part of the Batman mythos. Batman first appeared in Detective Comics issue 27, and his origin story wasn't explored until a few issues later in Detective Comics number 33. The initial origin story only took up a few panels and only gave the reader the gist of the events that transpired. The origin story wouldn't fully be fleshed out until years later when DC published Batman issue 47. At the beginning of Batman's career as a crime fighter, during the golden age of comics, he didn't have any qualms about killing people or using guns. In issue 37 of Detective Comics, Batman pushes a criminal into a sword stuck in a wall, killing him. He then says, "Dead. It is better that he should die. He might have sent thousands of others to their death on a battlefield." This idea of killing one to save many comes from the idea of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the philosophy of maximizing happiness for the most people possible, even if that means sacrificing the well-being of the minority to accomplish it. The most famous thought experiment of utilitarianism is known as the trolley problem. The trolley problem is a psychological thought experiment involving a train barreling towards 5 people on a track. In this hypothetical situation, you are standing at a switch that will reroute the train to a different track. This will save the group of 5 people, but will kill one person instead. Most people, when surveyed, say that they would pull the lever in order to save the 5 people, as opposed to the 1. Golden Age Batman followed this philosophy, occasionally killing criminals, whether by accident or on purpose, in order to stem the overwhelming tide of criminality in Gotham City. By the 1940s, American parents and other advocacy groups became concerned about comic books' influence on the minds of their young readers. The growing conversations around organized crime, gun control, and violence didn't help to improve the image of masked superheroes in the eyes of parents who wanted nothing more than to throw out their children's comic books. For most of American history, regulation of guns was a matter of state law. State-level regulation, however, came under tremendous pressure during the 1920s and 30s when Prohibition-era gangsters like Al Capone overwhelmed local police resources, and traveling desperados like Bonnie and Clyde easily escaped capture by racing across state lines. Following the public conversation around firearms and the mob, DC's editors were pressuring Batman's writers to do away with the guns and killing in order to keep public pressure off the publisher. This decision would lead to the famous 4th issue of Batman, where a small editor's note would change the character forever. In the fourth issue of Batman, which hit bookshelves and magazine stands in 1940, the Dark Knight brandishes a gun. But instead of killing the criminal he's chasing, he uses a bullet to disarm him. An editor's note in the lower right-hand corner of the panel states that, quote, "The Batman never carries or kills with a gun." From that moment on, Batman would rarely use guns or kill anyone, and the abhorrence of guns and death would slowly become a central tenet of the character. Batman's origin story was finally fleshed out in Batman issue 47, where gun violence would ultimately become the hero's call to action after it's revealed his parents were shot and killed when he was a boy. Interestingly, removing guns from Batman's arsenal also changed the way the character felt about the act of killing. Batman began to hate the idea of ending another life, even if that person was a criminal who might deserve it. The occasional criminal would still die at Batman's hands from time to time, usually by accident, but as the years went on, that number would shrink dramatically. The disarming of the Dark Knight reads like a concern about the Commonweal, a deferral to an accepted and important idea about the division between civilian and military life. Superheroes weren't soldiers or policemen, they were private citizens. They shouldn't carry concealed weapons. Villains carried guns. However, despite the fact that this aspect of the Dark Knight's creed would come up again and again for decades, it hasn't completely stopped Batman from eventually bearing arms again, if only for the occasional storyline. Most famously, his otherworldly doppelganger, Thomas Wayne, first introduced in Flashpoint, used guns very liberally. In Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, Batman uses guns multiple times in the book. In the book Final Crisis, Batman used a gun to kill the villain Darkseid before losing his own life in the process. And in the book Batman Year 2, the Dark Knight uses guns as a last resort in order to fight a villain named the Reaper. So while Batman's core rule was established very early on, it hasn't stopped various writers from breaking it from time to time with varying degrees of success. People have tried to sneak guns into the Batman mythology, but I think it's unfortunate because it does change the character. Batman has replaced the gun. He's replaced the gun with his costume and his ability to terrify gangsters for that little, short second where he can disarm them. Batman's aversion to guns and death wasn't always a part of the character, but it's proved to be one of his most defining characteristics. He began as a utilitarian killer, but ultimately became the paragon we know today through political movements and the fleshing out of his origin stories. And while guns have been snuck into the Batman mythos before, it's been very hit or miss as to whether it was poetically correct or just a gimmick for the story. Personally, I feel like the moment in Final Crisis where Batman uses a gun to kill Darkseid is the best example of how guns are inextricably linked to Batman's identity as a character. So it only makes sense that he would cease to exist once he was forced to use one. The mythological idea was killed in action the moment he pulled the trigger.